get started. Let's see. We need some volunteers. This Friday, the Life of Christ presentation is going to be from 5:30 to 8:30, and need some volunteers to help with the presentation. If you will let me know if you can help, I'll get you in touch with Miss Jane, and we'll find out what you need to do. Communion will be served this Sunday. Also, church board meeting this Sunday afternoon. And Wreaths Across America. When is that? December the 18th. That's coming up pretty quickly. And then the next night will be Christmas supper, Christmas program, talent show, whatever you want to call it. We'll be here anyway, 6 o'clock that night. Are there any other announcements? If you want to order some chicken, Benjamin is taking orders through Sunday. And do we have any prayer requests? Okay. Continue to pray for Kennedy. She had a little minor surgery yesterday. She may not think it was minor, but she didn't think. Y'all are vying for the install a zipper. Also, Mr. E.W. will be having surgery this Friday, so let's remember him. Continue to pray for Walter and Martha also. Your Uncle Eddie. Ashley Bowers. Yep. Remember the Frank Malta family. Okay. Any others? Then let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dalton, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for allowing us to come to your house to worship you, to fellowship with other believers, Father. Help us all to keep our eyes focused on you during this holiday season. Father, just help us to be able to be a blessing to others, to the world. Most of all, we just pray for each and every need that's on the prayer list. Father, you know the needs. Father, we pray that you just place a touching hand upon the ones that are sick, upon the ones that need something, Father. You know the need, Father. We pray that you just bless them with that need.
Amen. All right, let's go to class. Walk slowly. Take your time. A little bit slower. Yeah. Yeah, he was creeping back there. He wanted to make sure you got ahead of him.
That's right. He just knows he's going to be the head of the class.
All right. Anybody want to guess who we're talking about tonight? Besides Lisa? Let me give you a hint. David. So what do we know about David? He was a man after God's own heart. I like that one better than the rodeo. You've never used a sling before, have you?
My daddy made one time with leather, and I didn't do too good. Sure is.
What was David's occupation? He was a shepherd. And as a shepherd, he had the opportunity to practice with his, no, not his lasso, his sling. And one of the things that this lesson has, it says David was shrewd. So shrewd, what does shrewd mean? What does shrewd mean? Okay. It's when a person makes wise choices under pressure. And David had opportunities to do that. Remember when he was, well, the story we're going to focus on tonight is David and Goliath. Now, there are a lot of different stories that we could look at talking about David, but especially this is one of those stories that kind of stands out. And, of course, keep in mind that we're talking about heroes, right? Bible heroes. And so David is a young man still. Saul is king, and the Israelite army is fighting with the Philistines. And so Jesse called David in and said, I want you to take some things out to your brothers who are fighting with the Israelite army. And so David goes, and you know how, are there any other young baby boys here? You know, like the youngest? Am I the only one? Well, see, I understand David, because when David got there and David heard Goliath, he began asking around. Well, when his brothers saw him and heard him, they were giving him a hard time, because David, being the youngest, was curious. And I think that's one of the traits of the youngest child. We're kind of curious. We want to know what all's going on. And anyway, David heard Goliath. What was Goliath doing? What was let's kind of set the context, set the stage. What was Goliath doing? Yeah, but in what way? What exactly? Intimidating the soldiers, the Israelite army, and even the king was a little concerned and kind of scared about him. And now, let's kind of put this in perspective. How big was Goliath? I think 9 feet 6 inches was pretty close to 10 feet. Let's see, probably somewhere around in here. If he were standing right here, his head would be touching the ceiling. Would you be intimidated? I wouldn't. I'd be running. I wouldn't be anywhere around there. So here's this giant, David and the giant, right? That's the story, David and Goliath. And when David sees this giant of a man come down, David didn't see the giant. But David heard a man that was mocking not Israel and not the Israelite army, but who was he really mocking and making fun of? God. And so when David heard that, David got a little, he got just a little bit perturbed with it. Well, why are you making fun of God? And then, but more importantly, he looks around at the Israelite army and he says, is no one here going to stand up for God? I mean, that's kind of what David's thinking. And of course, his brothers are like, David, you're just a little boy. Let's leave it alone. This is not for you. It's not your battle. This is something for men to do, so you just stay out of it. And David listened to them for about 5 minutes, maybe a little bit longer than that, but it wasn't very long. And he hears Goliath taunting, and he sees nobody moving. In fact, the whole Israelite army, kind of as a group, just steps back away from him and backs up. And David's, we can't have that, can we? And so this little shepherd boy was shrewd, as we said, so he had the ability to think clearly in tough moments. And when he heard this, he knew that something had to be done. Now, David's weapon of choice as a shepherd boy was a slingshot. One of the reasons for that is because as a shepherd, David spent a lot of time sitting down, standing up, and going in different places. And so a sword or a spear or something like that would be in the way. But a slingshot was something that he had a pouch, and the slingshot you could roll up, put in that pouch, and he could have some little stones in that pouch, and everything would be fine. He could carry that no matter where he was. And as a shepherd, being out in the fields, he had a lot of opportunity to practice with that slingshot because he's out there a lot with the sheep. And you ever tried carrying on a conversation with sheep? Doesn't go very far, does it? It almost sound like they're laughing at you, wouldn't it? That's what I hear. No. And so one of the things that David did to bide his time was to practice with that slingshot. So he'd get some stones, he'd take it out, and he'd see something off in the distance, and he'd sling, and he'd practice until he could hit that. Well, one of the other things that David had to do as a shepherd is to protect his sheep, and he had killed a lion and a bear with that slingshot. Don't ever think that a little slingshot is just a toy, because it can be quite the weapon. And so David was asking around why nobody would stand up against Goliath. And King Saul heard it, called him to come up there. And David came up there, and I'm sure that Saul also, by the way, was a pretty big man, right? You remember the description of Saul? How tall was Saul? He was a head above everybody else, was the way it was described. So, you figure you get some men together that are, say, my height, then a head above me means that he was probably 6.5 to 7 feet tall. He was a big man himself. And David, we're not really told how big David was, but the way that David is described in Scripture implies that David was not a small man, but he was not a big man either. So probably somewhere around my height or so. I'm sure he was a little bit more fit than I am. Anyway, David, when Saul heard that, he called David up to him, and David goes to King Saul. And Saul, and he told the king, he said, we can't have this. We can't have the Philistines mocking God. And he said, I'll go and I'll fight him. And I'm sure Saul looked at David and was thinking to himself, are you crazy? There's no way you can stand up to him. And David said, it's not me that's going up against Goliath. Goliath is mocking God. And he said, when I was out tending my sheep, a bear came up and tried to take my sheep, and by God's help, I was able to defeat the bear. And a lion came up and tried to take the sheep, and with God's help, I was able to defeat the lion and protect my sheep. And he said, I can go up against this giant. And he said, it's not me, but God. God is the one who will defeat the giant. And so Saul said, okay, you're the only man willing to do it, so okay. He said, here, let's put my armor on you because you need to go in protected. Now, imagine how much bigger Saul's armor was than David. And so he put it on, and David kind of stood there for a minute, and he tried to move, and he couldn't hardly move with that armor, and he took it off. He said, I'm not used to wearing armor, and besides, it doesn't fit me well. And he said, besides, I'm not going in my own strength again, and it's not my armor, it's not the armor that's going to protect me, but it's God. And so he goes down to the brook, and he stopped, and he reached down, and he picked up some stones out of the brook. He put those stones in his pouch, took one of them out, and he put it in his sling, and he kind of held it there. And Goliath finally sees him down there. And he's like, what is this? They sent a boy to fight against me? And so Goliath begins to mock David, begins to laugh at him, and he comes towards David. And David did something a little odd. Anybody remember what David did? He ran towards Goliath. Now, why do you think he ran towards Goliath? God was behind him pushing him? Well, that's probably true too. Momentum. Because he's got that rock in that sling, and he's getting it going, and so he runs, and he throws that sling, and so that adds the momentum of him running, and as he releases that stone, the stone hits Goliath in the forehead. You know the adage, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And Goliath fell to the ground. So then what does David do? He goes up to Goliath, pulls his big sword out of his sheath, and I can just kind of picture him as he tries to pick that sword up, and he just kind of slings it and lets the sword fall and cuts Goliath's head off with his own sword. Interesting. What made David a hero that day? Was it using a sling to bring down the giant? Was it bringing down the giant? Was it defeating the Philistine army? What made David a hero that day? His faith in God. I'm going to add the word obedience to that. He allowed himself to be used by God. He was willing to do what God is asking him to do. There's so many times that I think that God speaks to us. And kind of like David, we're facing a giant. And that giant may take on different types of, come in different types of forms and formats and circumstances. But we're facing these circumstances, these giants, if you will, and God is kind of like Eleanor said, pushing us to do. And what we tend to do too often is what? Whoa, God, hang on a second now. Are you sure about this? You want me to go face this? When instead we ought to be like David and be running towards it, knowing that God's on our side. God's behind us. And what does anybody know what Romans 8:31 says? If God is for us, who can be against us? Who can stand against us? With God on our side, how can we lose? A more familiar way of putting it that I've heard is, God and I are a majority. Too many times when we're facing situations and facing difficulties, we're limited by not necessarily a lack of faith, but more of a lack of obedience. I think we have the faith. I think we believe that God is able to do and that God can keep and that God can carry, but we're still held back by uncertainty. And even though we have faith, the obedience, the doing is a little bit lacking. When things get tough, or when things got tough, David thought outside the box. He didn't think like all the other soldiers. He didn't think like King Saul. He didn't want to use the armor, didn't want to use the weapons that they used, because that's not what David was familiar with. And I believe the same is true of us. There are times when we're facing difficult situations and we're facing our own giants, and we try to face them based on what we've read and based on what someone else has done and how they dealt with these situations and how they did this and how they did that, and we think that that's what we need. We need to do what they did in order to defeat those giants and to be victorious. The problem with that is this: maybe God didn't gift you the same way He gifted them. Maybe they had a gift in that area. David, for example, the writer says that shrewdness was a gift that God gave to David. And I think that may be true. There are many other times that we can think of David facing situations and how David dealt with those situations, and it showed David's wisdom and that David was following God's guidance. And I think the same for us when we face these situations. Too often we want to look at what somebody else did or how somebody else did it and think that that's how we need to do it, when in reality, maybe we're looking at the wrong place. Maybe we ought to be looking at Scripture. Maybe we ought to be listening to what God is saying and do what He is saying to do. That's what David did. That's why David went with a sling. Not because everybody else was using a sword and he wanted to be different, but because that's what his gift was. That's what he was familiar with. That's the tool that he had, that he was comfortable with. And I think maybe if we would use the tools that we're comfortable with, the things that God has gifted us with, the abilities and the wisdom, the knowledge that we have, that we've learned, the things that God has given to us, we can better face these situations and better deal with these situations when we allow God to work using what we have and obediently walking with God, I think we'd be amazed at what we could accomplish, and that we too could become heroes, maybe not quite like David, but that we could be a hero and accomplish God's purpose and God's will. There are other times, situations that I mentioned later on when David was facing Saul, when Saul was trying to kill him. And there were several times that David had opportunities that he could have killed Saul. But he did what? He refused to. There was one time when he even went up and cut off part of Saul's robe. Remember that one? In the cave? And he cut off part of Saul's robe, and then he went back in the cave. And then after Saul went out into the valley, he came out and he called Saul. And he said, "Hey, you were just in here, right?" And he held up that piece of his robe. And Saul looked down and saw where his robe was cut. And David said, "I could have killed you, but I refused to." There was another time when his soldiers wanted to kill Saul. They had a perfect opportunity, and David would not let them, said, "No, we're not going to do it, because he is God's anointed. He's God's chosen. It's not our place to do that. God will take care of that in his time. We're not going to do it." And it shows the wisdom that David had and how David was willing to let God work in his life and in God's time. And too many times, again, we tend to be a little impatient sometimes, right? We want what we want when we want it, or maybe the day before. And we don't like to wait, because waiting is so difficult. But when we look at David's example, and that period of time that David was waiting to become king, we find David learning things. David was growing. God was teaching David different lessons. He was facing various situations, but he was learning through those situations. And the same is true for us. As we're waiting on God's will, waiting on God to work, waiting on God to do, he's teaching us lessons. There are things that we need to learn. Most of the time, we don't know what they are. In fact, a lot of times we don't even realize what we've learned until after the fact, and you look back at the situation and you realize, oh, that's what God was doing. That's what he was teaching me. That's what he wanted me to get from that situation, that circumstance. And again, God never allows things to come. I made reference to Romans 8:31. If God is for us, who can stand against us? And that comes just after Romans 8:28, which says that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. God has a plan for us. Jeremiah says that God knows the thoughts that he has for us, the plans for us. And he has plans to help us, to work with us, for us to improve, to grow. We don't always know what those plans are. We don't always know what God's doing, but God is at work. And so what we can learn from David then is, I think probably the biggest or best lesson that we can learn from David is to let God use us in the way that he wants to use us. Be obedient. When God says go, go. When God says do, do. Don't question God as to why or how or anything like that. Just simply walk with him, obey him, do what he's asking you to do, and we'll be amazed at how God will work things out, not just in our lives, but in the lives of those around us as well. Any questions, any comments on David? No, if not, then let's stand, and Keith, would you dismiss us in prayer, please?